Back in the 1990s, people sometimes said that serious storytelling was for books and movies, not television. Television wasn't supposed to tell great stories. Television wasn't supposed to be this good. Television wasn't supposed to have a golden age. On January 10th, 1999, everything changed. I still remember seeing that first episode of The Sopranos. It was January, it was 9 p.m., and it was cold. Now, the internet existed in 1999, but not like today. There was no YouTube, there was no Reddit, there were no spoilers on the internet, just word of mouth from someone at work who said, "You have to see this show, don't miss it." The introductory sequence blew me away. They had been done before on shows like The X-Files and even older shows like Hawaii Five-0, but never to show a mobster commuting. Series creator David Chase said the purpose of it was to show that this was a mafia show set in New Jersey and not New York, where most mob films, such as those made by Martin Scorsese, had used as the setting up to that point in time. Although this episode is sometimes referred to as simply Pilot, it's also titled The Sopranos, which is more fitting, in a way, since this episode introduces The Sopranos. There's Tony, Dr. Melfi, Carmela, Fielder, and her friend Hunter, her brother AJ, Christopher Moltisanti, Junior, Silvio, Paulie, Big Pussy Bompancero, Hesh, and there's just a whole crew of these guys. Now, the episode begins with a shot of Tony between the legs of a matriarchal statue, or mythological goddess of some kind, while he waits to see Dr. Melfi. Now, David Chase in his director's commentary indicates that he doesn't recall why he chose that as the first shot, but the opening shot is sometimes like the opening hook of a book, and I can't help but think that this is highly symbolic of the psychological scars Tony has from his strained relationship with his mother. He's literally trapped by her in a mental prison he can't see. This foretells the conflicts he has with his mother, and the psychological scars she inflicted on him in childhood. In some ways, you could say that this is really indicating what the overall conflict of the entire first season, or perhaps the entire show, is going to be. When Tony enters Melfi's office, she lets him choose which chair to sit in. I wonder if there's a parallel universe where he picks the other chair, and there's some sort of butterfly effect, and the outcome of Tony's entire life in the show is vastly different. But perhaps we'll never know. But there are 5 somewhat parallel plot lines in this first episode. The first plot line is Tony in psychotherapy. This is the primary plot, and it involves Tony meeting with Dr. Melfi and trying to cure himself from these panic attacks he just suddenly started having. Plotline number 2 is the McAfee and his gambling debt. This is this guy named McAfee. He works for some sort of medical HMO type company, and he owes Tony a substantial amount of money. Plotline number 3 is the Triborough Tower situation. There's these Czechoslovakians who are incorrectly referred to as Polacks, and they try to move in on Tony's territory, and Christopher whacks a guy. Plotline number 4 is Tony and Junior. They're in a conflict. Junior wants to whack a guy in Artie's restaurant. This becomes a more general conflict regarding Tony versus the older generation, and in some ways it ties into the conflict he experiences with his mother. Plotline number 5 is Carmela and Fielder. They have a fight over Fielder wanting to go to Aspen with Hunter, but Carmen grounds her when she's caught sneaking out when she was supposed to be doing her homework. Wah, wah, wah. So, how to break down these plots. So Tony's first therapy session with Dr. Melfi is what kicks off the episode and the entire series. This is really a brilliant setup. It allows for natural exposition since Tony is telling her about everything leading up to his panic attack, so it gives him a reason to talk about his day. Melfi being Italian also gives Tony a reason for asking her about her own ancestry and pride in it, something that comes up later in the Fielder subplot. Tony's nostalgia for the past and anxiety about the future is great characterization. Good writing often has greed and fear as drivers, sort of like a push-pull dynamic, and gives the viewer a very good sense of who he is right away. On David Chase's commentary, he mentions how Tony's panic attacks were written into the show to give him a physical symptom of depression, something that forced him to go to therapy, since if he was merely depressed, it wouldn't have been as believable that a mob guy would just be going to a shrink and saying he's depressed. For this first episode, the Tony Melfi plotline is notable in that Dr. Melfi quickly identifies the ducks in Tony's pool and the accompanying fear of Tony losing his family as the source of his depression. This revelation drives the narrative of not only the first episode and the first season, but the entire series. Now, the McAfee subplot is actually subtly brilliant. in that it ties into Tony's anxieties and fears about the past, present, and future. When Tony beats up McAfee, he mentions how McAfee has been bad-mouthing Tony and telling people that Tony is nothing compared to the people who used to run North Jersey. This ties directly to what Tony says to Melfi at the beginning, about the good times being behind him, and the implication being that he won't fill his father's shoes. I think it's important to note here that in the pilot episode, Tony is depicted as being the boss of the family and not a capo. This is something that's later retconned, but we'll get to that later. Now, McAfee is also a reminder of Artie's possible future if Junior whacks a guy in Artie's restaurant. Artie could end up in debt to the wrong people, and his life could be ruined just like McAfee's. And in the present, Hesh and Puss ridicule McAfee for his depression. Now, this shows how not understanding these mob guys might be towards Tony if they find out that he's seeing a therapist. But more importantly, it's a reminder that the symptoms of depression aren't just physical panic attacks, but a problem rooted deep in the mind. McAfee's depression is what led him to gambling and ruining his life. The danger Tony is facing is not just limited to panic attacks. He has issues buried deep under the surface that emerge, such as his rage towards Christopher. Now, in mythology, water often symbolizes the unconscious mind and the dangers hidden below the surface. If only there was an animal that existed both above and below the surface of the water, symbolizing Tony's anxiety and the dangers of his depression, both in the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. Or maybe I'm just seeing things that really aren't there and I need to discontinue the lithium. The Triborough Towers plotline is about the conflict between the Czech mobsters moving on Tony's territory, but also about the dynamic between Christopher and Tony's conflict with the future. Tony's first mention of Christopher is regarding a decline in values among his business associates. Tony criticizes Christopher for not calling Dick Barone about the Triborough Towers garbage contract. Tony even tells Melfi that Christopher just bought himself a $60,000 Lexus. That's in 1999 money, by the way. Today that would be about 118 grand, approximately. Now, Tony's resentment seems to be rooted in the form of envy. Christopher is very successful considering his age. Ironically, Junior seems to envy Tony the same way Tony envies Christopher. But more on that later. When they see McAfee and chase him down, Tony yells at Christopher to come over and help beat up the guy. He expects Christopher to work and take the initiative when necessary. This pressure from Tony is what leads Christopher to whack Email Kolar. Sorry, y'all, I'm bad with names. It's a bit rash and Christopher is behaving like a loose cannon. Literally. As a character, Christopher ties into Tony's initial anxiety about the best days already being over. Tony is the boss and wants to exercise control over everything, including the future. Christopher is a literal embodiment of the future, as he is the up-and-coming new generation of mobsters. Chris even mentions this to Email before he whacks him. I wonder if the cleaver is foreshadowing the film that they produce much later in the show, by the way. Also, Tony correcting Christopher when he says garbage is their bread and butter to was their bread and butter shows that Tony is concerned about the future and the need to adapt to the ever-changing world around them. He mentions a similar concern to Melfi regarding the RICO statutes. Like most characters, Christopher is not one-dimensional. In some ways, he's just as nostalgic as Tony, as he imagines old-school gangsters while whacking Email, and when committing a hit doesn't result in any praise, Christopher considers quitting the mob life for greener pastures in drought-prone Hollywood. Tony angrily convinces him to stay, despite his own serious misgivings about their way of life not having a viable future. In conclusion, although Tony encourages Christopher to take the initiative, he's also critical of Christopher's impulsiveness. Going back to the idea of Tony lamenting that he's come to the end and the good times are over, he's clearly trying to exercise control over the future as a way to manage that anxiety. And although Tony is the boss of the family, Christopher's rebelliousness plays against Tony's need to be in control and presents Christopher as a character who will continue to be a source of uncertainty for Tony's already untenable future. Even though the Triborough Towers plotline ends with Tony and his crew winning the contract when the competing crew withdraws their bid, the future is a tide of change high enough to cast a looming shadow. The plotline between Tony and Junior is the primary conflict in this episode, with Junior wanting to whack Little Puss in a restaurant that belongs to Artie, Tony's longtime friend. Tony tries to convince Junior to do the hit somewhere else, because murdering someone might permanently scare off Artie's customers, ruining his business and life. Just as Christopher provides a real representation of Tony's anxiety about the future, Junior represents Tony's conflict with the past and the values Tony wishes were more common today. In many ways, Tony is nostalgic for the past. He mentions to Melfi in the beginning that while his father didn't reach Tony's level of financial success, he had his people and their values. And when Tony is beating up McAfee, he mentions how McAfee has been going around telling people that Tony is nothing compared to the people who used to run things. I wonder if Tony is more mad at that than about the gambling debt, and if it struck a nerve that he's unable to fill his father's shoes. And when Tony gets an MRI post-panic attack, Carmela comments, here he goes with the nostalgia again, when he says, we've had some good times, implying that he's spoken about the good old days a notable amount of times already. Yet Tony struggles against the past, personally with his mother Livia and in terms of business with his uncle Junior. The conflict with his mother is mostly about him wanting to put her into a nursing home. Oh, I'm sorry, I meant a retirement community. And I wonder if the struggle he has with Junior is more complicated than it initially appears. One of the key details about Junior's goal in this episode is that he wants to assassinate Little Puss Malanga, a turncoat who betrayed the mob. Tony never questions Junior killing the guy. In fact, Tony indirectly seems to agree. Tony mentions to Melfi that guys used to honor the Mafia's code of silence, but these days they have no room for the penal experience. And the episode College isn't much later, where Tony shows what he really thinks about traitors. For Tony, it's only a question of where Junior does this, and he doesn't want Artie's business ruined. But does it go beyond merely valuing his friendship with Artie? Something else Tony mentions is whatever happened to Gary Cooper, the strong silent type. Now, Artie gripes to his wife once in this episode, but Tony doesn't see this. When Tony gives Artie the cruise tickets, he even asks him, when's the last time you had a vacation? Artie can't seem to recall. Artie, in a way, is the strong silent type. The determined American diligently and unceremoniously plugging away and toiling to build something that's his own. Simply doing what he has to do. Artie has the diligence that Tony wishes Christopher had, and the mental fortitude to deal with his own problems. As far as Tony knows, Artie doesn't see a shrink. More so than even Junior, in some ways, Artie subtly embodies the old school values Tony wishes were more common today, and values he wishes he had himself but doesn't. Now, Christopher, Tony, and Junior are all from different generations and form something of a multi-generational conflict. Tony envies and resents Christopher for buying a $60,000 Lexus at such a young age and dropping the ball on the Triborough Towers initially. Yet Junior envies Tony's success. This is something that Hesh even mentions at the Bing. He tells Tony that Junior resents Tony because, well, Tony became a made man at a younger age, and also because he's the boss, even though Junior is the elder of the family. Hesh also mentions that man is driven in toto by his insecurities. Junior resents that Tony has achieved a higher degree of success than him. It's clear at the same time that Tony is nostalgic for the past. But so is Christopher, thinking of old school mobsters as he shoots email with round after round. In fact, where Chris hides his gun to me seems reminiscent of The Godfather and the Michael Corleone scene. Between Christopher, Tony, and Junior, the older generations envy the younger ones, while the younger generations are nostalgic for the old times. Although Tony is nostalgic for the past and the values and unspoken codes of honor and silence, when confronted with the real cost to his friend Artie, Tony knowingly uses an underhanded means to prevent Junior from carrying out a hit on a traitor and turncoat. In doing so, Tony betrays the very values he nostalgically yearns for, to help someone who does have those values. It also knocks over the first domino in the larger conflict between Junior and Tony for the entire season, immediately leading to Junior's conversation with Livia about how Tony interfered in Junior's business, and something might need to be done about him. Now, the Carmela and Fielder subplot begins when Carmela catches Fielder trying to sneak back into their home after sneaking out, and Carmela grounds her. Fielder at times ignores her mother and also refuses to go to the Plaza Hotel for tea and scones, their little tradition. She even says or implies that when she grows up, she hopes she's not living in New Jersey anymore, that she lives far away from here. Fielder finds it hypocritical that she's grounded for lying when her entire family is dishonest, and implies that she knows that her father makes a dishonest living as a mobster. Like most of the Great Sopranos subplots, it relates to other characters and plotlines too. For example, Tony and Carmela. Carmela implies in an early scene regarding Tony being home for AJ's birthday party that she's not talking about work. The subtext here is that she knows Tony is unfaithful to her and is seeing a Gumar. Later, Tony goes to a restaurant with his Gumar, and the very next scene he's at the same restaurant again, but this time with Carmela. I really do like the detail that the host of the restaurant, an erudite man with a cultured Italian accent, asks Mr. Soprano where he's been all this time, as though he wasn't just there the prior night with his Gumar. In Tony's world, everybody implicitly knows the corrupt little games they're required to play. Tony also takes Fielder to a church and tells her how her ancestors came to America and built that place. In some ways, he does this to both humble and inspire her. And this is a really key aspect of Tony's character development. Earlier, he tells Melfi how his Uncle Junior told him long ago that he never had the makings of a varsity athlete, which had a tremendous effect on his self-esteem. But here he's telling Fielder that Carmela and him both think that Fielder is capable of being a top student. Semi-related to this is Tony telling a somber Christopher that he should have been more encouraging and supportive when Christopher took care of the Triborough Tower situation. Getting back to the scene in the church, it also provides backstory for Tony in terms of why he's nostalgic. There's a real reason to be proud of his heritage. Sharing this story with Fielder shows that their family is not all hypocrites, and that there's substantial shoes for her to fill. Fielder and Christopher both are Tony's chance to bring that nostalgic pride into the present and future. Now, anytime I watch a television program or a movie, I wonder, what was it all about? One of the things I learned when I started writing is the idea of thematic variation. In fact, there's a book written by John Truby called The Anatomy of Story, and in it he discusses the notion of thematic rectangles, in which different characters and their plot lines represent different aspects of theme. Now, the first pattern I noticed was how different characters accept or reject the corruption of the Soprano family. David Chase mentions on the director's commentary of this episode that Carmela has made a literal deal with the devil by marrying Tony. Yet Fielder rejects the hypocrisy, refuses to honor her mother's tea and scones tradition, and even says that she wants to get far away from New Jersey. Now, Charmaine rejects the free cruise tickets Tony offers Artie. And when Junior floats the idea of whacking Tony, Livia says nothing in defense of her own son. For these four characters, they either accept or reject corruption. Carmela and Fielder are mother and daughter, and therefore part of Tony's immediate family. Charmaine tells Artie it's bad enough that the mobsters patronize the restaurant, and she doesn't want those tickets because she doesn't want to be involved or associated with Tony's shady business. And although Livia is Tony's mother, she's stone cold in all business. Something worth noting here is that 3 generations are represented: the World War II generation, the Boomer generation, and the Gen X Millennial generation. Applying the same idea to the male characters resulted in a similar thematic rectangle regarding friendship and family. Tony burns Artie's restaurant even though it messes up his Uncle Junior's plans to whack Little Puss, so Tony chooses friendship over family. Now, Artie rejects the tickets his friend Tony offered him at the behest of his wife. Artie chooses family over friendship. Christopher lures Email to a meeting, and for a brief moment they agree that, as the younger generation, they have issues in common. But it's all a ruse to whack the poor kid. This is also an interesting parallel in that Chris lures Email to an eatery and kills him, which isn't really much different than Junior's plan. Once Tony messes up Junior's plan to hit Little Puss, Junior tells Livia he might make a move on Tony, his own nephew. Just like with Livia, Junior rejects the familial relationship in favor of business. Another interesting thought I had long ago when I first saw this episode is that no details were provided for how Tony's father died. And I wondered at the time if Junior killed his own brother over something similar. Another possible theme is individuals and their identities versus their assumed role in the Soprano family. I like this idea since the episode is, after all, called The Sopranos. Now, Fielder and Christopher are the younger generation and trying to establish and form their own independent identities. Fielder wants to go to Aspen with Hunter more than she wants to go for tea and scones with her mother. She's more concerned with creating her own future than honoring past family traditions. Christopher takes the initiative with the Triborough Tower situation in order to make a name for himself. And when that doesn't seem to be working out, he considers going to Hollywood and maybe even playing himself in a movie about himself. Livia and Junior are, of course, the old guard, the World War II generation. In 1999, many in that generation were in their 70s and were struggling to maintain their independence. Livia firmly fights against Tony's idea of sending her to a nursing home. A retirement community. Livia insists that her own son should stop telling her how to live her own life. Now, Junior wants Tony to stay out of his business. He even tells Tony that while Tony may run North Jersey, he doesn't run his Uncle Junior. Another way of looking at the Boomer characters and themes is how duty and financial security impact an individual's identity. This all goes back to Tony's concern about the lack of values. Today, Americans are chasing success even at the cost of values. As Fielder points out, both her parents are hypocrites. Tony wants the benefits of married life but doesn't want to remain faithful. With his Uncle Junior, Tony wants to stop him from ruining Artie's restaurant, but he can't directly oppose him and instead finds an underhanded way to sabotage him, a choice that could be seen as dishonorable in the mafia world. The foil or opposing character to Tony is Artie, who wants to be friends with Tony, but he takes his vows and role as a husband so seriously that he returns the tickets Tony offered him, really at his wife's behest. Carmela wants the financial security that comes with Tony's blood money, but she wants to still be a good Catholic. The foil to Carmela is Artie's wife Charmaine, who refuses the cruise tickets because somebody probably donated their kneecaps for them. The kneecap remark actually in some ways seems ironic to me, given McAfee's leg status in this episode. Now this is Charmaine's only scene with dialogue, and she's bussing tables, something you'll never see Carmela do. But Charmaine would rather get her hands dirty than take dirty money. These two couples couldn't be more different. Charmaine and Artie allow themselves to be defined by their values, such as their obligations as husband and wife, and their commitment to integrity, even if these commitments constrict their choices and options in life. Carmela and Tony are the opposite. They're both hypocrites. They both want the benefits of their choices without owning up to the consequences. And it's ironic that this is the very thing Tony complains to Melfi about in the beginning, the lack of values among Americans who chase success at all cost. I think it's important to note that all 8 of these characters are related to some or all of the other characters in some way. Among the old guard, the World War II generation, Olivia and Junior are brother and sister-in-law. Among the boomers, Carmela and Tony are married, as are Charmaine and Artie. And Carmela and Charmaine and Tony and Artie are respectively friends. And you could say that they're really all friends with each other. Among the Gen X and Millennials, Fielder and Christopher are cousins. Fielder is also Tony and Carmela's daughter, and Christopher is Tony's nephew. I think to sum up the themes of this episode, I'm not sure if I'm interpreting the episode's themes correctly, but I do love that this show allows for so many different interpretations of the meaning behind the characters and their choices. Now, I don't think this episode has too many obvious goofs, but the one detail that sticks out is that in the pilot, Tony is implied to be the boss of North Jersey, and there's no mention of Jackie Aprile Sr. And this is based upon the fact that Junior tells Tony that Tony may run North Jersey, but he doesn't run his Uncle Junior. Charmaine refers to Tony as the Don of New Jersey, and Hesh also indicates that Tony is in fact the boss of the family. However, this is very cleverly retconned later, in which Tony is a capo, but is also shown to be a shadow prince. Now, a shadow prince is a term that comes from medieval times in Europe, in which there would sometimes be someone who wasn't actually in charge, wasn't actually, like, say, the king of a particular country, but they knew all the king's advisors, all the power players in the political structure, and they were kind of pulling strings behind the scenes, kind of like a puppet master. And I do think it's really clever how David Chase and the writers of the show were able to sort of cleverly and subtly retcon this particular detail of changing Tony from the boss to a capo. We'll talk about this more in later episodes. In terms of memes from this particular episode, there are some quotes that, you know, if you go over to like the Sopranos subreddit, you'll see these quotes come up a lot, like Tony saying that, he never had the makings of a varsity athlete, Livia saying, listen to him, he knows everything, Tony telling Melfi that he has a semester and a half of college, so he understands therapy as a concept. Also, whatever happened to the strong, silent type like Gary Cooper. AJ's famous quote of, what, no F-word, ZD? And Tony telling Carmela, always with the drama. In terms of pop culture references, this show does reference other mafia media. Christopher makes a reference to Luca Brasi from The Godfather. The actors Dominic Chianese, who plays Junior, was also in The Godfather Part 2. And Michael Imperioli and Lorraine Bracco, of course, were both in Goodfellas. Now, for the soundtrack for this episode, Woke Up This Morning by Alabama 3 became the series' iconic intro song for the entirety of the series. There's also an Annie Lennox song in the pilot episode, and I think David Chase used some of her music a few times over the course of the series, especially the first season. I imagine he's probably a fan. Rumble by Link Ray and his Rayman is the classical guitar riff song from 1958. It plays when Tony's meeting with the guys in front of the pork store. I do recall recognizing that song back in 1999 when the pilot episode aired because it was in Pulp Fiction a couple years earlier. Well, a couple years earlier. Pulp Fiction came out in 94. The Beast in Me is the song at the very end, And it's kind of fitting because I think the question that's introduced with Tony is, will the beast in him destroy his family? It's kind of a fitting song for this episode. Now, in terms of the kill count running total, Christopher whacks Emil Kolar, achieving first blood! And the current whack count as of this episode is 1, just Emil. So now it's time for some conclusions. The pilot episode is aptly named The Sopranos. The plot introduces the characters and the world they live in, North Jersey, in the summer of 1998. This episode was directed and written by David Chase. There's a director's commentary available on the Blu-ray version that I have. David Chase is joined on this commentary track by Peter Bogdanovich, who plays the role of Elliot, Dr. Melfi's therapist, later in the show. I definitely recommend checking this out since David Chase only directed 2 episodes, and this is one of his few commentary tracks. And I like Peter's comments too. Peter points out that there's this great cut that David used when Tony tells Melfi nothing happened with McAfee, they had coffee, and the scene immediately cuts to McAfee dropping coffee. One of the most fascinating things David Chase mentions on his commentary track is how he always had a backup plan to turn the pilot episode into the beginning of a movie if no television network picked up the series for development. I can't help but notice that this affected many of the production choices that Chase made. The show is filmed the way a movie is. In some ways, I remember that all the way back in '99, the wide shot of Tony at the golf course looked like a shot from a movie more than from a television show. And filming the pilot this way really set a very high bar for production standards that, for the sake of consistency alone, had to be maintained in subsequent episodes. This ultimately gave the entire show a look and feel beyond what other shows offered at the time, and it, in some ways, you could say it defined the baseline for the golden age of television. The plot is also written with this movie backup plan in mind, it seems. The end of the first episode could serve as both the end of a pilot episode or the end of the first act of a movie, in which the hero prevails against obstacles but also sets up for the darkest moment that often occurs at the end of Act 2. I think it's really on account of the fact that Tony's wins aren't really on steady ground. He saved Artie's restaurant, but Junior and Olivia are now plotting to have Tony assassinated. McAfee reminds Tony that anyone can succumb to depression. The Triborough Towers contract was won, but Christopher is considering leaving the mob entirely. Tony's panic attacks have stopped for now, but Melfi says that more work has to be done. And the final shot of the empty pool at the end shows that Tony's anxiety remains in the background. Tony won by toppling dominoes, the effects of which are looming over him, darker than any cloud in the sky. And that's my recap of episode 1 of season 1 of The Sopranos, pilot/The Sopranos. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And please leave a comment if you have any thoughts you'd like to share about the pilot episode. I really like talking about this show, and I really like to hear other people's thoughts on it. And I'm going to continue my rewatch with episode 2 of season 1, 46 long. And as soon as I get a chance to watch it and get a video together, I'll put it up right away. And other than that, I guess that's all I have for today. So thank you again for watching, and have a good one.